Hi, this is a demo for using Entity Framework Core with IRIS. Entity Framework Core allows users to work with the IRIS database using .NET objects, and it's built on top of our ADO.NET driver, so it uses SQL statements for most of its actions. This is opposed to the .NET bindings or IRIS native for .NET, which uses method calls for object manipulation. This demo assumes that the user is familiar with .NET and IRIS and a little bit about Entity Framework. It will include both a code-first and a database-first demo. And for this demo, you need IRIS 2025.1 or later, as well as the .NET 8 SDK or later. And this demo uses Visual Studio 2022, but you can also use the command line for .NET. Okay, the first part is going to be a code-first demo that models blogs and their associated posts. So for a code-first demo, we're going to start with .NET code, and then we will use that to write objects, and then model those in IRIS as SQL tables after. So we're going to create a new project that is a console application. And we're going to make sure to use at least .NET 8. Okay, so the first thing that you'll need to do is make sure you have a dependency on the InterSystems Entity Framework Core IRIS project. So to do that, you can add a dependency multiple different ways. We're going to use the NuGet Package Manager console. So we use the install package command to add this as a dependency. We can see that it was successfully added. We will also need the Entity Framework Core Tools dependency. So we'll add that as well. And for this one, I'm using version 8.0.16 because that's the latest version that our Entity Framework Core IRIS package supports. Now we're going to add the code for the entities that we want to create. To help organize for this demo, we'll put them in a folder called Models. The first class we're going to add is blog. And we're also going to add post. Then we need to add in the properties for each of these classes. So blog is going to have an ID, a name, and a list of posts. And that list of posts represents a relationship between our two entities, between blog and post. This is a one-to-many relationship because every single post has one blog, but a blog can have many posts. Now we're going to add in the properties for post. We can see this has an ID, title, content, and then we have the opposite side of that same relationship we showed represented here. We're storing both the blog ID and the blog in this demo. Next, we need to add a context object. These contexts are necessary when using Entity Framework Core. They are used to actually connect to the IRIS database, and they perform a single unit of work, and then they're expected to be disposed. So let's create a new context class. We will call it blogging context. And the important thing to do when creating a context class is to extend DB context. The context also needs to keep track of all the entities that we want to map into IRIS. So in this case, it is blogs and posts. We also, importantly, need to be able to connect to the IRIS database. So we do that using the method useIris, and we pass in a connection string. So this is the same connection string that you would use for an IRIS ADO connection. It takes in various parameters about your IRIS installation, and we want to note the namespace because that's the one where the tables will actually get created. Okay, now that we have the entities all set up, we're going to actually connect to IRIS and create the tables for these entities, and we do that using migrations. So again, in the package manager console, we're going to add a new migration. You can title this whatever you want. I'm going to call it initial create. And executing that command will create a class for that migration called initial create. And this contains information about the migration. We're creating two tables, blogs and posts, and there's information about those tables. You don't have to edit anything in these classes, but you can look over them to make sure they're correct before updating the database. It also creates a model snapshot class. Similarly, you don't have to edit anything in this class, but you can look over it if you'd like. Now that we've created the migrations, we have to actually implement them in IRIS. So we do that with the update database command, and it applied our single migration, and it's succeeded. So now we can double check what this meant in IRIS. So I have the management portal open up to the same namespace that I used before, demo, that's the one we connected to. And I'm going to go ahead and check the tables, and we see we have one for blogs and one for posts. Those are the two entities that we created in .NET. If we click on fields, we can see that it has both the blog ID and name. Posts has post ID, title, content, as well as blog ID. And if we look at constraints, we can see that it has a foreign key referencing blog ID. And that's how IRIS keeps track of the relationship that we created in .NET. There's also this Entity Framework Migrations History table, and that just keeps track of what migrations have been applied. So we can see that the initial create migration was applied. Now that we have the models created, we can interact with the data on the .NET side. So let's go back to the .NET project, and we can open up Program. Let's start by creating a blog. So the first thing you need to do when interacting with data is create an instance of the context that will be used to do one unit of work, and then it will be disposed. In this case, we are creating an instance of blog. We are adding that to the context, so the context knows about it and knows to create it in IRIS. And then we need to call save changes at the end. That will actually persist the changes into IRIS. Okay, let's run the code and see what happens. Code completed. Now let's check in IRIS. We can open up the blogs table, and we now see that the blog we created is in this table. Perfect. Once we've created a blog, we can also read or modify them. So let's try those operations next. So to query for a blog, we are using link queries that will take the blogs table and get the first element when ordered by blog ID. Then we are updating the blog. First, we are changing the name, and then we are creating a new post and adding it to the blog's list of posts. Then finally, we're saving the changes to make sure that these get persisted in IRIS. So let's run this. That succeeded. So now we can go into IRIS. If we open up blogs, we see that the name was in fact changed. We can also open up posts and see there is a new post in here that matches the one we created. It also has a blog ID of 1, which corresponds to the ID of the blog that it is related to. Lastly, we can delete blogs or entities. So I'll use the same code to query. But we will delete the blog by calling remove on the context object. And that will let the context know that it needs to delete the associated entity. And then, of course, calling save changes. And if we run that, that succeeded. Now in IRIS, we can see that the blog is no longer there. And the post that was associated with the blog has also been deleted. Okay, that concludes the code first portion of the demo. Next, we will move into a database first demo. So the database first is useful if you already have tables and data in the database, and then you want to scaffold those into .NET and use them as .NET objects. So for this demo, we're going to model a database of coupons for a pizza restaurant. So let's switch to a new namespace. Everything in the namespace will be scaffolded into .NET. So you want to make sure that you're using a namespace where you want all of the tables to be used in .NET. So since it's database first, we're going to start with some SQL statements here in IRIS. We're going to create a table called coupon that has an ID, a description, and an expiration that's stored as a date time. We're also going to populate this table with some data. So we added 2 rows of data, and we can just double check that that succeeded. We see the coupons table with the 2 pieces of data. And we also see that the only table in this namespace is coupon. Now let's scaffold this into .NET. We'll create a new project. Again, we want a console app that targets .NET 8 or later. Now, same as before, we need to add in the two dependencies, the same two dependencies that we used before. So for this demo, I'm going to use the NuGet Package Manager console. We install the InterSystems Entity Framework Core IRIS driver. And we also install the Entity Framework Core Tools package. And we can double check that both of those were added successfully. Now, in order to scaffold those tables from IRIS into .NET, we use the scaffold db context command. For now, I'm using the NuGet Package Manager console, but you could also do this using the command line for .NET. This command takes in a connection string. This is the same as before. It's also the same as the IRIS ADO.NET connection string. Make sure that the credentials match your IRIS instance, and also importantly, make sure that the namespace matches the one with the tables you want to use and doesn't include any tables that you don't want to use. Additionally, it takes in the name of the Entity Framework Core provider. So we have the one for InterSystems IRIS named there. And then optionally, for this demo, I've included an output directory of models, which means that the models that this command generates will go in a folder called models. Now you'll get this warning about having your connection string stored in plain text in the code. For the purposes of this demo, we're going to ignore that warning and we're going to keep it there. But if you were using this in a production environment, you may want to store it somewhere more secure. And we can see that this scaffold database context command created a context object. It's the promotions context, and it knows about coupons. That's the entities that we care about. Also, the onConfiguring method calls useIris, same as we did in the code first, and it puts in our connection string. Lastly, there's this onModelCreating method that includes details about the model that we got from IRIS. So it's the coupon table, and it has some information about the properties, such as that description has a max length, and it has the column types for the other properties as well. In addition, this command created the coupon class, and we can see that it has 3 properties corresponding to the 3 columns that we created. Now we can interact with this code and this data the same way that we did in the code first demonstration. For this demo, we're going to simply create a new promotions context. That always needs to happen whenever you're connecting to the database. We're just going to get a list of all of the coupons and iterate through them and print out their properties. And there we can see that the data that's printed out matches the data that we inserted in IRIS. And then you can interact with this in any way, same way that we did before. You can create, update, query, and delete any of these entities. So that's it. That concludes the database first demo. There's a lot more information about Entity Framework Core out there, a lot more demos, and they should work with IRIS as long as you add the InterSystems Entity Framework Core IRIS provider as a dependency and call use IRIS in the context. For more information about the specifics of what is and isn't supported, that's detailed in the README for the InterSystems Entity Framework Core IRIS package up on NuGet. And that's it.